Welcome to Midnight Casebook, where every shadow hides a secret and every mystery begs to be solved. Tonight, we unravel the chilling tale of Father Brown and the Angel Fell Inside Confession, a fan-made story paying homage to the brilliance of G.K. Chesterton's legendary detective. We'd love to have you along for this enigmatic journey. Drop a comment to let us know where you're watching from, share your theories, and if you spot any inconsistencies, don't hesitate to call them out. Your keen eyes and sharp minds help us craft even more captivating mysteries in the future. Chapter 1. Father Brown finds an angel's secret. They found the body beneath the altar, face turned toward the carved crucifix, but the wings were not hers. Rain clawed at the stained glass windows of St. Hallows as the coroner's cart rolled away, leaving Father Brown alone with the scent of wax and something far more ancient. He didn't speak, didn't pray, just stared at the blood drying across the marble, as though the girl, if she was a girl, had whispered a riddle into the stillness that only he could hear. She had fallen inside the confessional sometime before dawn. That much was certain. What was not certain, what gnawed at the edges of every whispered theory and sidelong glance, was how she'd gotten there, why her hands were folded in prayer, and why two long white feathers were tucked inside her mouth. The villagers murmured the word angel, as if they were afraid to breathe too loud. But Father Brown had seen too much, lost too much, to believe in convenient symbols. Still, even he could not explain how the girl's skin shimmered faintly beneath the candlelight, or why every mirror in the rectory had cracked during the same midnight hour. She had no name, no purse, no history in the parish records, no footprints in the wet gravel, nothing but silence, blood, and the feathers. It was as if she had simply descended from the rafters and died mid-prayer. But Father Brown knew better than to believe in descent without a fall. Was it murder? The inspector asked him. No, Father Brown said quietly. It was an invitation. That's when the real unraveling began. By the next morning, someone had broken into the sacristy, not to steal, not to desecrate, but to leave something behind. A hand-drawn sketch of the confessional booth, with 3 figures instead of 2. One kneeling, one listening, one watching from the shadows. The paper smelled faintly of lavender and rot. Father Brown took it without a word and tucked it inside his coat. Then he turned toward the chapel and looked up, not at the cross, but at the ceiling beams above it. Something was carved there now that hadn't been carved yesterday. It read, "Her wings burned when she confessed," and suddenly he remembered a story from years ago, one he'd buried beneath dust and shame. A girl, a lie, a death ruled accidental, and feathers scattered like snow across a wooden floor. What he hadn't remembered, what chilled him now, was that he had been the one to hear her final confession. Back then, she'd whispered the same phrase, "He told me I was an angel. That's why he cut them off." That girl had disappeared. This one had returned. But it wasn't the same girl. It couldn't be. And yet, down in the village, the florist closed early. The baker spilled salt and crossed himself. A child screamed at a shadow in the shape of wings. Something was unraveling faster than reason, and Father Brown could feel the world tip slightly underfoot. The girl's body was moved to the crypt. She vanished by morning. No locks were broken. No earth disturbed. The candles beside her bier still flickered, warm and untouched, and yet the stone slab was empty. The feathers remained. Father Brown didn't report it. Instead, he returned to the confession booth and sat in silence for over 3 hours, not to pray, but to listen. to the wood, the draft, the memory. He reached beneath the bench and found a single object wrapped in old velvet, a child's rosary, blackened with soot. When he touched it, something cracked, not outside, but inside him. He recognized it, not from this church, not even from this county, but from a fire that had taken an orphanage 20 years ago. A fire set by a girl who said she saw angels in the cellar, angels who told her what to burn. She hadn't survived. They'd said her body was never found. But her rosary was here. And so was the phrase, burned into the side of the confession bench, "Forgive me for flying." Father Brown stumbled back and nearly dropped it. For the first time in a long, long while, his breath wouldn't come easily. He left the church that night and walked to the edge of the moor where the old asylum had once stood. It was razed now, nothing but wildflowers and one lonely iron gate. But someone had recently tied feathers to it with red string. Dozens, hundreds, each with a number written in ash. They weren't grave markers, they were page numbers. And that's when he knew. The feathers in the girl's mouth weren't symbolic. They were ripped from a book that should not exist, a book that, if opened, would not reveal chapters, but confessions no soul should ever read. He returned to the church. The bell tower had shattered a pane. Something had entered, or perhaps returned. A note awaited him beneath the crucifix. No name, just 5 words. You forgave the wrong one. It wasn't the handwriting of the girl, it was the same script from the sketch, the one watching from the shadows. And then Father Brown remembered a chilling detail from the broken asylum records. 3 girls had escaped that night, not one. One confessed, one burned, one vanished. He had buried 2. But what if the third was the one who had been listening? The girl in the confessional may not have been the victim. She may have been the bait. Father Brown pressed a trembling hand to the booth wall and whispered, "I know who you are." The booth creaked. Behind the screen, nothing stirred. But outside, the church doors had been opened, wide, and something wet trailed in from the steps. He looked down. Feathers, but not white, black, drenched, burned. One word etched in soot across the marble floor. Confess. And that's when the bell tolled, 13 times. No one was pulling the rope. Father Brown turned, face pale, and muttered just loud enough for the shadow behind him to hear, "I know who did it, but the truth will never be told." Chapter 2. Confession box hid a murder. The knife wasn't in the victim's chest. It was nailed beneath the priest's seat, still warm from the blood. By the time Father Brown arrived at St. Veronica's, the smell of incense couldn't mask the copper. The villagers stood outside in a stunned semicircle, eyes darting toward the tall steeple like it might fall. A child clutched a candle too tightly, wax dripping unnoticed down her wrist. Somewhere, a bell chimed. Not the church bell, but a smaller one. One meant for signaling a penitent in the box. Only this time, there would be no forgiveness. Inside, the confessional was dark. Too dark. The left booth stood ajar, its curtain half torn, as though someone had fled. The right side, the priest's seat, was closed, locked from the inside. When the constable forced it open, they found the body slumped against the screen, robes soaked crimson, mouth frozen mid-whisper. The eyes weren't closed. They were staring up, wide, not in fear, but recognition. And beneath the seat, tucked into the wood with a deliberate malice, was the knife. Not just any blade, an ecclesiastical letter opener, brass, engraved with a verse, "And the truth shall set you free." But there was no truth here, only silence. No blood trail, no sign of struggle, No open windows. No stranger seen entering or leaving the church. And most chilling of all, the confessional bell had rung after the priest was already dead. Father Brown walked in, slow, taking in the old wood, the soot-stained saints on the walls, the flickering votives. His fingers brushed the curtain and paused. Someone had stitched something into the hem, in thread so fine it almost escaped the eye. 4 words glinted faintly. She never forgave him. That was when he knew this wasn't a murder. Not really. It was a sentence, carried out in the one place the guilty believe they are safe. The problem was, no one knew who the victim had last spoken to. The confession schedule had been altered the night before due to an illness. The roster hadn't been updated, and the church's logbook, typically signed by the attending priest, was torn from the spine. Only one page remained. On it, a single line in childlike scrawl. I heard what she said. That night, the church doors were bolted. The body was removed, but Father Brown remained inside. He sat in the confessional, not to confess, but to listen. Hours passed. Just as the last candle guttered, the bell chimed once. No one was there, but when he stood, the hem of his cassock was wet. He looked down. A pool of ink had seeped through the confessional floorboards. Ink, not blood. It spelled 3 letters before vanishing. A.M.D. Ad majorem Dei gloriam, the Jesuit motto. The murdered priest hadn't been Jesuit, but Father Brown remembered something. In seminary, long ago, there'd been a boy who always carved those initials into his desk, a boy who later disappeared under suspicion, not of heresy or theft, but of something worse, betrayal. He had been caught forging letters of confession, secretly manipulating the faithful for his own ends, expelled, forgotten, until now. The victim, Father Merrick, had served at that same seminary for a year before coming to St. Veronica's, and it was he who had testified against the forger. It couldn't be coincidence, but there was no trace of that disgraced student. Or was there? A local woman, Mrs. Elbridge, claimed she'd seen a man in robes outside the church the week before. Said he wasn't one of the regulars. Said he wore gloves in August. More chilling, she said he had no shadow when he walked past the graveyard gate. Father Brown knew shadows don't disappear, but men do. He asked the bishop for old records, was told the file had been sealed. By who? Father Merrick himself. Why seal a file on a boy already condemned, unless he wasn't trying to protect the church, but protect someone else? The next morning, a package arrived at the rectory. No return address. Inside, a confessional grill, scorched at the edges, taken, it seemed, from the very booth Father Merrick had died in. Tied to it, a note. He never heard me. It wasn't the handwriting from the last note. 2 different writers, 2 different agendas. One of them a murderer. The other, something worse? Father Brown pressed the charred grill to the light. A faint shape appeared. A fingerprint, smudged but distinct, burned into the metal. Not an accident. A message. He rushed it to the police. They matched it. Not to a man, but to a girl. A girl who'd vanished 3 years ago after reporting her own father for abuse. The case had been thrown out. The priest who took her confession? Father Merrick. Suddenly, the entire timeline split in 2. Was the murder a reckoning or a cover-up? And what about the ink on the floor, the phrase stitched in the curtain? Mrs. Elbridge returned to the church 2 days later. She'd remembered something. On the night of the murder, she'd seen a boy, no older than 17, staring at the confessional from outside, just standing there, not moving. She called out. He turned, smiled, but she said his eyes weren't human. Not possessed, not evil, just empty, like he didn't remember who he was supposed to be. That was when Father Brown did something strange. He requested the floor beneath the confessional be removed. The workers laughed, until they found what was hidden there. A second compartment, locked with an iron key. Inside, dozens of handwritten pages, each a confession, each unsigned, but all of them describing the same man, kind, soft-spoken, and violent in the dark. The dates spanned a decade, and the descriptions matched Father Merrick. But no formal charges were ever filed. Why? Because someone had burned the archive records, all except one. A single name remained in faded ink: Julian Dorrell, the same boy from the seminary, the same forger. Only this time, he hadn't forged anything. He'd preserved it. He had copied every real confession before they could be destroyed, and hidden them beneath the priest who silenced them. Father Brown felt the floor sway beneath him. It wasn't just murder. It was memory, weaponized. But then, who rang the bell? Who stitched the curtain? Who sent the grill? 3 voices, 3 truths, 1 crime. And just when Father Brown thought the darkest moment had passed, he received a final letter. No stamp, no seal, no ink, just a single sheet, burned at the edges, written in blood. He made me say it. Father Brown stared at the script. It wasn't the childlike scrawl. It wasn't the woman's hand. It wasn't the forger's. It was Father Merrick's. He had written it, which meant he'd confessed. To what? And to whom? That night, the confession booth burned. No cause was found, no accelerant detected. And yet, the only thing left untouched was the curtain, still stitched, still saying, she never forgave him. The question was, who was she? The girl who vanished? The mother who lost her child? Or something far older, darker, and more patient? Father Brown walked the church alone at dawn and whispered, I know who did it, but the truth would only kill again. Behind him, the bell rang once, and no one was there. Chapter 3. The priest heard something impossible. The voice that spoke inside the confession box had been dead for 17 years. Father Mallory did not scream. He did not flee. He simply froze, one trembling hand still resting on the latch, the other clutching the rosary tight enough to split skin. The booth was dark, quiet, empty, or so he thought. The moment he slid the partition open, the voice came through. Calm, steady, familiar. It whispered a name no one had dared speak in that village for nearly 2 decades. Not because they forgot, but because they'd buried the memory like a corpse no one wanted to exhume. The voice said, Father, it's me. I remember what you did. No wind moved, no candle flickered. The church was empty, but for him. And yet, the voice had breath. It had weight. And worst of all, it was, unmistakably hers, Eliza Hartford, declared dead 17 years ago. Found at the edge of Ashvale Marsh, her body mutilated, wrists bound in rosary twine, eyes open toward the steeple. The case was closed. The coroner ruled it ritualistic. Her killer never found. But now she was confessing. To what? To who? And how? The next morning, Father Mallory's hair had gone completely white. He refused to leave his chambers, refused to speak. When asked what happened, he wrote just 3 words on the inside of a hymnal. She isn't done yet. They brought in Father Brown. When he entered St. Jude's Parish, the air felt wrong. Thicker, as if something unseen was leaning against every beam and rafter, listening from just outside the light. The confession booth stood as it always had, simple, wooden, clean. But something in the grain had changed. The varnish was darker, older. Or perhaps it only seemed that way because of what Father Mallory claimed to have heard. Father Brown didn't believe in ghosts. He believed in guilt. But guilt has a voice, and sometimes it borrows a familiar face to speak. He inspected the booth. Nothing strange, no trickery. But just as he turned to leave, something caught his eye. A fingernail scratch in the floorboard. A single name, carved so deep it had splintered the wood. Eliza. He asked to see the original records of her death. The church clerk hesitated, then admitted something chilling. The file had been moved. By Father Mallory. 2 weeks ago. No one knew why. When Father Brown visited Mallory's quarters, he found every page from the old Hartford case stacked in precise columns. Nothing missing, but something added. An envelope sealed with wax. The seal bore no crest, only a spiral. Inside was a letter written in crimson ink. I spoke my truth once. No one believed me. So I'll whisper it now, again and again, until even the dead wake up screaming. Father Brown turned pale, not because of what the letter said, but because of what it smelled like. Salt water and ash, the scent of Ashvale Marsh, where Eliza was found, where no fire had ever burned, where no one should still bleed. He traveled there at dusk. The reeds swayed like whispers, the air tasted metallic, and in the distance, by the old chapel ruins, he saw something that shouldn't have been there. A confessional booth, half sunk in mud, crumbling and open. He waded toward it, ignoring the cold, the filth, the sense of something crawling beneath the water. He stepped inside, and the door slammed shut behind him. No wind, no rope, just gravity and something else. Then the voice came, not Eliza's, a man's, old, calm. You shouldn't be here, Father. He didn't answer. The voice continued. She remembers everything. The booth filled with the scent of roses and blood. Father Brown whispered, "Who are you?" The reply chilled him. She called me father once too. When the door opened again, no one stood outside, but etched into the inside of the booth was a phrase written in damp soot. One confession is still missing. Back in the village, a woman came forward. Elderly, frail. Her name, Nora Bell, once the parish nurse. She claimed to know the truth about Eliza. She was pregnant, she said, and she didn't fall into that marsh. She ran. From who? Father Brown asked. Nora's hand trembled. She said only one word. The church. And then she collapsed. By the time the doctor arrived, she was gone. In her hand, a broken rosary, each bead carved with a letter. Spelled out they read, "Forgive me, Eliza." Father Brown dug deeper. Records of confession around Eliza's time were sanitized, whole weeks missing, and a name appeared again and again, redacted but obvious in pattern. Father Mallory. Only he had access to both sides of the booth that month. Only he knew the layout of the church well enough to hide what was found years later beneath the vestry. A child's rattle, half-burned, wrapped in linen that bore the Hartford crest. Father Brown confronted Mallory. The man was a shell, weeping, mute, unable or unwilling to speak. But he handed over a tape recorder, one that hadn't existed 17 years ago. He pressed play. There was static, then a whisper, then the voice again. I never lied, Father, but someone did. Then the sound of splashing, a scream, and the slow rising creak of a confessional booth opening underwater. That night, Father Brown returned to St. Jude's alone. He sat inside the box, waited, and just before the clock struck midnight, the partition slid open by itself. He looked through. No one, but a shadow moved in the shape of a kneeling girl. And then the impossible happened. He heard his own voice, from years ago, saying, "I forgive you, Eliza. I believe you." He had never said those words. Not to her, not to anyone. The partition closed. A feather fell from the ceiling. White, wet, burned at the edges, and carved into the bench beside him were the words, "She still waits for the last confession." The next morning, the confession booth was gone. Only mud remained where it had stood. No one had seen anyone remove it. Father Brown stood in the empty space, staring at the ceiling. The spiral symbol had returned, and beneath it, 3 names burned into the wood. Only one he recognized, his own. The other 2 were blank, waiting. "I know who did it," he whispered, "but the truth would bury this village all over again." Behind him, a voice laughed softly, the same laugh from the tape. And then, silence. Chapter 4. Whispers echoed after the gunshot. The shot didn't kill him, but the whispers that followed made sure he'd never speak again. The villagers said it was a hunting accident. Said the banker, Mr. Lowell, had gone into the woods with 2 other men and stumbled across a rogue fox. But foxes don't shoot back, and no one could explain why the bullet entered through the back of his neck, or why, moments after he collapsed, every mirror in St. Dominic's parish cracked, including the one hanging in the confession booth. Father Brown arrived that same evening. He'd been called not by the police, nor the bishop, but by a nameless letter slid beneath his door, sealed with wax that bore no emblem, only a phrase etched with the tip of a razor. He didn't die for sin. He died because he knew one. By the time Father Brown stepped through the stone arches of the village, the fog was so thick it looked like the air was mourning. Silence clung to every cobblestone, every crooked fence, as though the town itself was waiting to hear what would be said next, or what wouldn't. They found Mr. Lowell alive, but barely. He was muttering, not names, not prayers, but something stranger, rhythmic, circular. It wasn't until the nurse wrote the words down that the horror set in. He was repeating a confession, not his own, but one he shouldn't have heard. A woman's voice. A phrase looped again and again, as if her last breath had attached itself to his dying mind. "I told him I buried it, but he dug too deep." No one knew what it meant, but Father Brown did, or rather, he remembered. Years ago, when Mr. Lowell's wife died under mysterious circumstances, she'd been buried with a closed casket. No autopsy, no wake, just dirt, grief, and a donation to the church so large it wiped out the parish's debt. At the time, Father Brown had asked too many questions. He'd been transferred within a week, and now Mr. Lowell was bleeding out with her voice in his skull. But here's what chilled Father Brown most. That night, when the village clock struck midnight, the birds began singing. No one understood why. Birdsong in the dead of night, as if the earth had reversed. And then the whispers began. Children heard them behind their pillows. The baker swore the flour sack spoke. A woman fled her home because her chimney whispered her name. And every whisper was the same. Ask the priest what he buried. Father Brown didn't flinch. He returned to the confession booth, knelt where 100 villagers had knelt, and waited. He didn't expect to hear anything, but he did. Not a voice, a breathing, not his. From the other side, he opened the partition slowly and found nothing, except a scrap of lace, soaked in something red, tucked into the corner. The same lace Mrs. Lowell had worn on her wedding veil, and stitched into it, using her own hair, was a single phrase: "He took the wrong child." Father Brown stepped into the graveyard that night, dug with his hands, ignored the warnings, ignored the rules. When he found her casket, he opened it. Inside, no body, only stone, smooth, carved with the name Thomas. No one named Thomas had ever lived in that village, and yet the grave bore her name. He knew then. Someone had swapped the graves, swapped the coffins, buried a lie, and hoped no one would exhume the truth. But someone had, and someone had paid for it with a bullet. The next morning, another villager was found collapsed on the chapel floor, dead, age 25. His name, Elijah Crane, the gravedigger's son. Never suspected. No known ties to the Lowells, but in his pocket, a photo of a woman holding a baby. The woman, Mrs. Lowell. The baby, not her son. The boy was labeled Thomas on the back in trembling script. Father Brown studied the image for hours, not because of who was in it, but because of what was in the corner. A shadow of a hand holding a gun, pointed toward the crib. The gun matched the exact model used to shoot Mr. Lowell. No fingerprints, just one clean wipe. But Father Brown knew how guilt lingers. It doesn't fade, it coils. So he did something no one expected. He held a public confession, offered absolution to anyone willing to speak in the open. The church was packed. No one moved until the bell rang. No one had touched it. And then from the back, an old woman stood, her name lost to the town, her hair white as frost, her eyes blind. She spoke only 7 words. The boy was never meant to live. Silence, and then she laughed, low, unending. Father Brown asked, "Whose boy?" She answered, "The one who looked like him." That night, her house burned down. She didn't scream. She was already dead before the flames took her. Suffocated by mud, not smoke. Mud filled her lungs, mud that hadn't come from the fire, but from the marsh. And in her palm, the same lace scrap, folded once more. This time, with a new phrase, "He was supposed to be born dead." Father Brown wept that night, because he knew, not who killed whom, not yet, but that someone had killed before the gunshot, and someone else was killing after. He returned to Mr. Lowell's bedside. The man no longer spoke, but he smiled when Father Brown whispered a name. Thomas. And then, without warning, Mr. Lowell flatlined. His last breath carried a single sound, not a word, a coo, like an infant, but distorted, hollow, as if it came from beneath the floor. The next day, the altar was removed. They found bones, small, curled, wrapped in velvet with a single rosary tucked between them. A child, the real Thomas, the child no one ever baptized, no one ever mourned, and scratched into the bone of his tiny skull. He heard the shot too. Father Brown turned away from the light and into the shadow of the booth once more, and whispered, "I know who did it, but they're not the one we buried." Behind him, the whispers began again, and this time they were saying his name. Chapter 5. She died after saying, "Forgive." She was smiling when she died, smiling and holding the throat of the man she loved. When they found Clara Wren in the bell tower of St. Augustine's, her hands were curled tight around a rosary so old the beads had turned to dust. Her lips were blue, but her eyes, God help them, her eyes were bright, alive, like she'd seen something so terrible and beautiful that her mind had refused to close. And just before she collapsed, before the last shudder of her pulse, she whispered one word to the priest kneeling beside her. "Forgive." No one knew who she meant. The word spread through the village like smoke. By morning, 3 versions of her death existed, and by evening, 6. Some said she'd confessed to murder. Some said she'd been poisoned. Some swore she'd jumped. Others swore she'd been pushed. But the truth lay in the whisper. That one word. Forgive. Forgive who? Father Brown arrived the next day, his cassock heavy with rain and old grief. He'd seen death before, too much of it, but never one that felt this wrong. The church bell was cracked, its echo distorted, sounding less like metal and more like a throat trying to speak. The floor of the tower still smelled of smoke, even though no fire had been set. And on the wall behind the altar, someone had scrawled a line of scripture in blood that wasn't hers. Forgive them not, for they knew. That was how it began. The constable said Clara's death was simple, a heart attack brought on by shock. But Father Brown looked at her fingers. The nails were split, the skin beneath blackened with ash. No woman who'd simply fallen ill would claw the floor as she died. Something or someone had terrified her in her final breath. He found a letter in her room, unopened, addressed not to the police, not to her sister, but to him. He broke the seal with trembling hands. Inside were 6 words, written in ink that had barely dried. It wasn't his voice that night. That night, the night of the storm. The same night the bell cracked. The same night Clara was heard arguing with a man no one saw enter or leave. Witnesses said she had been alone. They said she'd screamed once. Then silence. But there was one detail no one could explain. When the police broke down the tower door, they found 2 sets of footprints in the dust, hers and another that ended halfway across the floor. The prints just stopped, as if the owner had vanished mid-step. Father Brown stared at those prints for a long time. He'd seen that kind of disappearance before, not in flesh, but in faith, a moment when guilt becomes so powerful it consumes the sinner completely. He walked to the altar. There, beneath the candle wax, he found something strange, a lock of hair tied with wire, pressed into the crack between the stones. Clara's hair, but not as a keepsake, as a seal, a barrier. He'd seen it once before, in a village haunted by its own sins, where the faithful buried tokens of confession to silence the dead. That was when he realized Clara hadn't been asking to forgive someone. She'd been warning them. Forgive before it finds you. That night, Father Brown stayed in the church. The rain hadn't stopped, and the wind made the tower moan. He sat in the pews, staring at the pulpit, where Clara had once sung. The air felt heavy, like the hush before thunder. Then he heard it, a voice, soft, close. Father? He turned. No one there. Father, he forgave the wrong one. He froze. It was Clara's voice, exactly. He stood, his heart pounding, his breath uneven. And then the bells above began to sway, not ringing, not moving by wind, but trembling, like something inside the metal was alive and trying to get out. When he climbed the stairs, he saw it. The bell rope had been cut, and wrapped around it, as if strangled mid-fall, was a single glove, men's, black leather, soaked through with water. Inside it, folded so tightly the paper had fused to the lining, was another note. He said forgiveness would save me, but he lied. The handwriting was hers, but the ink, still wet. It couldn't be. She'd been dead 2 days. Father Brown went to the cemetery that night. He dug at her grave with his hands, cold mud caking his nails. When he found the coffin, he opened it and froze. It wasn't her. The body inside was too old, too decayed. The bones of a woman buried decades before Clara was even born. The nameplate on the coffin had been switched. Clara Wren's body was missing. He stumbled back, breath clouding in the air, his mind whirling. If Clara wasn't in her grave, where was she? And then he remembered the lock of hair, the seal in the tower. Someone had moved her body, hidden it, sealed it away, not out of cruelty, out of fear. Whatever Clara had seen before she died, it hadn't died with her. In the following days, more letters appeared, all addressed to Father Brown. Each one written in the same trembling hand, each one signed, "The one you forgave." But Father Brown had never heard a confession under that name. He searched the parish logs. Nothing. Until he found an entry crossed out in red ink. A name. Amos Wren. Clara's father. Dead 20 years. Suicide. The entry was brief, but the confession had been long. Too long to record. And at the bottom of the page, in a smaller, darker script, one the original priest hadn't written, were the words, "He said she would live again if I forgave him." Father Brown felt his chest tighten. The next night, the tower bell tolled once, though no one pulled the rope. He climbed the stairs again, this time with lantern in hand. The air was freezing. The flame flickered blue, and carved into the stone near the window was a new phrase, fresh, as if etched by fingernail. "Forgive him." He turned, and the light caught something in the corner. A figure, small, kneeling. He moved closer. It was Clara, her dress damp, her lips parted in that same half-smile. She whispered, "It wasn't my voice that night." Then she was gone. No scream, no shadow, no air displaced. Only the echo of her word, "Forgive," rippling through the tower like a breath that refused to die. When dawn came, the entire church smelled faintly of lilies, the flower of death, and the confession booth was found open. Inside, another glove, matching the first. This one held a bullet, engraved with a single word, "Forgive." And that was when Father Brown finally understood. The gun from chapter 4, the bell that cracked, the voices that echoed after the shot. They weren't separate mysteries, they were confessions, echoes, each one a link in a chain, forged by one act of mercy too freely given. He had forgiven the wrong man. The guilt had multiplied. The sin had learned to speak. That evening, the church filled for Mass. The villagers whispered of miracles, of ghosts, of voices calling in the night. But when Father Brown stepped up to the pulpit, he said nothing. He simply stared at the pew where Clara had once sat, her ghost-like smile still fresh in his mind. Then quietly, he spoke. "There are some things heaven cannot forgive." He closed the Bible, and the bell above began to ring again. 3 times, each louder than the last. And on the third toll, the cracked glass windows shuddered and split, scattering light like broken halos across the floor. When they looked up, the rope had moved on its own, swaying gently, as though someone invisible were climbing it. Someone small, someone smiling, someone whispering, again and again, one final word, "Forgive." The villagers fled. The constable fainted. But Father Brown only whispered into the rising storm, his voice hollow, his soul heavy. "I know who did it," he said, "but the truth will never be told." Because the truth was this: Clara Wren had died forgiving a man who didn't deserve it, and now her forgiveness was killing everyone who did. Chapter 6. Father Brown's candle revealed blood. The candle was never meant to burn that long, nor to reveal what lay beneath it. It started as a vigil, simple and small. Father Brown had lit the candle for Clara Wren, the girl who died, whispering, "Forgive," before her heart stopped. But 3 nights after her burial, the flame refused to die. Even when he snuffed it with his fingers, the wick glowed red, pulsing like a heartbeat. The wax pooled strangely, dark, thick, and slow. And when it spilled over the brass holder, it didn't harden into white. It hardened into red. Blood. Red. That was the first night. By the second, the parish was whispering. The tower bell tolled once at midnight, though no one pulled the rope. Birds fell dead on the steps, their beaks streaked with soot. And when Father Brown went to replace the candle, he found something carved into the oak table beneath it. Words so small, he had to trace them with a trembling finger to read, "It wasn't her blood you buried." He froze, because he knew whose blood it was. The same candle had been used 2 decades earlier, in another parish, for another funeral, the funeral of Amos Wren, Clara's father, the man who confessed to sins so deep, the church sealed his last words in the archive vault and forbade them ever to be read again. But what no one knew was that the candle had never been extinguished then, either. It had been moved, hidden, waiting. Now, after 20 years, it was burning again. That night, Father Brown didn't sleep. The flame's light flickered against his walls, bending and distorting shadows into shapes that looked almost human. At times, he thought he heard whispering. At times, he thought the light dimmed whenever he breathed too loudly. But it was near dawn, when the candle sputtered and revealed the first horror. The wax split in half, and beneath it, something shimmered. A line of crimson, real, wet, and fresh. Blood. From where? From when? He touched it. It was warm. Then he heard the knock. 3 slow taps on the chapel door. He opened it expecting the constable. Instead, a girl stood there, pale, thin, eyes like mirrors that reflected candlelight, but no emotion. She said her name was Lillian. She said she'd come for confession. He brought her inside. She wouldn't meet his gaze. Her hands trembled when he asked her what burden she carried. And then, without warning, she whispered, "I lit that candle first, Father." He froze. "How?" "I found it in the crypt," she said. "By the grave that isn't hers." He asked what she meant. But before she could answer, the candle flared so violently the brass cracked. She screamed. The light went out, and when he struck a match to relight it, she was gone. No sound, no door, no trace of steps, only the candle, still warm, and the blood beneath it, spreading wider. Father Brown examined the wax again, but this time it wasn't just blood. There were shapes forming inside the melt. Letters, a word. Trade. Trade? Trade for what? The next morning, he found the parish ledger open on his desk. The page had changed. The entry for Clara's funeral now had another name beside it, written in ink that hadn't been there yesterday. Lillian Gray. She'd never signed it. She'd never existed in the records before. But the ledger said she'd been buried yesterday. Alive. He went to the graveyard at dawn. Mud clung to his boots. The air smelled of rust and rain. Every grave was still, every name familiar, until he reached the one marked Clara Wren. There was a second candle burning there. Its wax ran red, and beside it, half buried in the soil, was a human hand. Not hers. The ring on the finger bore the seal of the clergy. He knew that ring. He'd seen it once on the hand of Father Mallory. But Mallory had died weeks ago, shot through the chest. Father Brown staggered back. The blood wasn't Clara's. The candle hadn't been hers. It had been Mallory's. But then, what had Lillian meant by trade? Back inside the rectory, the walls felt smaller. He found the old records Mallory kept locked away. Sermons, letters, confession transcripts. One caught his attention. The handwriting wasn't Mallory's, it was Clara's. And beneath her name, a second signature, faint but legible. Lillian Gray. Her confession read only one line. He promised I'd live in her place. That was when the blood on the candle began to boil, literally boil. Father Brown stepped back, crossing himself, whispering Latin. But the wax erupted, splattering the walls, spelling something in uneven strokes. You forgave him. She didn't. He fell to his knees, shaking. Then he saw it. The flame hadn't gone out. It had turned black. The wick burned without light, only smoke. And in that smoke, shapes formed, faces, the priest, the girl, the father, the victims, each one whispering a word he couldn't bear to hear. Forgive. He ran outside, into the rain. The entire church smelled like blood. When he looked back through the window, the candle still burned, and beside it, someone was standing. Lillian, alive, smiling. She lifted her hand and pressed a single finger to her lips. Then the flame went out. The church plunged into darkness. When the light returned, every crucifix had turned upside down, and the words "Trade accepted" were painted across the altar in blood. He collapsed. By morning, the parishioners found him unconscious. The candle burned to the base, and a small pool of red surrounding it. Dry, flaking, unmistakable, human blood, but not his. The police found no prints, no source, no missing person. Yet when they lifted the candle holder, they discovered another engraving underneath. A date, tomorrow's. Father Brown awoke in the infirmary, feverish and pale. The bishop visited, but he barely spoke. The doctor said he kept muttering one phrase in delirium: "The flame remembers." That night, he escaped his bed, returned to the church, lit the candle again. The flame rose higher than before. The shadows crawled, and then from behind him, a voice. "You shouldn't have taken her confession, Father." He turned. It was Mallory, or what was left of him, half his face blackened, the bullet wound gaping, but his eyes were clear. "She wasn't meant for heaven or hell," Mallory said, "only for the candle." Father Brown whispered, "Whose blood is it?" Mallory smiled. "Yours, when it ends," then vanished. When dawn broke, the candle had burned down entirely, and beneath it, carved into the table, were 3 initials, FBM, Father Brown's own. The wax trail led to the confessional, and inside it hung another candle, new, white, untouched. Except it wasn't wax, it was tallow, made from flesh. And embedded in its side, his own rosary. That evening, the villagers gathered for Mass, unaware of what had transpired. They found Father Brown standing before the altar, pale as parchment, candlelight trembling in his hands. He didn't preach, he didn't pray, he simply stared at the congregation and whispered, "The light shows everything we hide." Then he placed the candle on the altar and struck a match. For a moment, nothing happened. Then the flame flared blood red, spreading in a line toward the pews. The villagers screamed. Some ran. Others fell to their knees. And in the chaos, the bell tower rang once, long, deafening, final. When it stopped, Father Brown was gone. The altar was empty, the candle extinguished, but the wax remained warm. And written in the last streak of blood were 6 words that no one dared read aloud. He forgave her. She forgave no one. Days later, the church was sealed. No one dared enter again. But every night, from the other side of the doors, the faint glow of a single candle could still be seen, burning, bleeding, whispering. Some say it waits for another priest to light it again. Others say it already has. And somewhere, in a small parish far away, another candle burns red, beneath another name carved freshly into the oak, Father Brown. And though no one will ever admit it aloud, those who've seen the flame swear it flickers in rhythm with a heartbeat, not one that's alive, but one that refuses to die, And if you ever find yourself in an empty church, staring at a candle that burns too bright, don't blow it out, because the wax remembers the blood, and forgiveness, once given, cannot be taken back. I know who did it. Father Brown's voice echoes somewhere unseen, but the truth will never be told. Chapter 7. The killer sat in silence. He sat in the front pew every Sunday for 9 years, bowed head, folded hands, rosary clutched like a holy man. Yet the police only discovered he was the killer after the final mass, when the blood began seeping from beneath his seat. No one saw him leave. No one heard a scream. But the floorboards beneath him were soaked. And when the choir stood to sing, the organ let out a note that wasn't music. It was a scream warped by wood and age. The priest collapsed mid-hymn, and the man who had sat so devoutly for a decade, gone. Not a coat left behind. Not a name in the logbook. Not even dust where his feet should have been. They checked the cameras. Static. They searched the confession booth. Empty. The only clue was a torn page from a hymnal, stained red, with 4 words written in the margins. I never stopped listening. Father Brown arrived the next morning, summoned not by law, but by fear. The village was silent. The church locked. The parishioners too frightened to speak. No one would say his name, because no one knew it. And yet everyone swore he had always been there, in every wedding, every funeral, every baptism, always in the same seat, always, still, always quiet. And now, gone, except for the blood. Father Brown entered the sanctuary and lit a candle. It flickered wildly despite the still air. The pew was untouched, but the floor beneath it creaked unnaturally. He lifted the rug and found what no one else had dared to see. A trapdoor, not new, not clean, old, ancient wood, sealed with a rusted iron latch, and carved into its surface, so faint it took candlelight to reveal, below waits the unheard confession. He opened it. The smell hit him first. Earth, bone, ash, then the darkness. He climbed down. Stone walls surrounded him, dripping with moisture. Rats fled, dust shifted, and then, at the end of the corridor, a room, small, circular, lined with mirrors, each one covered in rosary beads. On the floor, a chair, empty, facing a single object, a confessional partition, but no booth, just the screen, floating in the center. He knelt beside it, and that's when the voice came. Not loud, not whispering, just there. You forgave them all, Father. Even me. He spun around. No one. The mirror behind him had fogged, but only on one side, from breath. Inside it, something had been written in the condensation. I confess to you in 1956. That was impossible. Father Brown hadn't yet taken holy orders in 1956. He wiped the mirror. A face blinked back. Not his. Pale, unblinking, and then it vanished. He returned to the surface and found the entire congregation waiting, eyes wide, silent. They hadn't called the police. They hadn't left, because each of them had, at one time or another, spoken to the man in the front pew, not about sin, about secrets, and none remembered what they'd told him. But each woke that morning with blood on their hands, literal, the butcher, the teacher, the widow, all with dried, flaking red smeared across their palms. No injuries, no memory, just a phrase echoing in their ears when they tried to sleep. Say it again. Father Brown gathered them inside the church. They refused to speak. He brought holy water. It boiled. He read scripture. The pages curled black at the edges. And when he reached for the candle he'd lit before, he found the wax had frozen solid, and inside it, suspended like a relic, a human tooth. He took it to the coroner. The analysis came back strange. It wasn't recent. It was over 60 years old, but the enamel still held heat, and the DNA an exact match to Father Brown. Only it wasn't his. It belonged to someone else with no recorded birth. A match that shouldn't exist. He returned to the chapel. This time, he sat in the killer's pew. The wood groaned beneath him, not from weight, but from memory. The voices began instantly, dozens, hundreds, each one a confession, each one spoken directly into his skull. Voices of people long dead. Some were victims, some were monsters, but all were whispering one name. Not the killer's, his own. "Father Brown," they chanted, "you listened too well." He stood. The pew was soaked again, but not with blood, with ink. Black, thick, clinging to his robes, it spelled a word across the aisle. Witness. He understood then. The man in the pew hadn't killed. Not directly. He had heard enough sins that they began to rot, fester, turn to violence. He was never the knife, only the echo that never left, the one who took the weight of every confession and made others carry it, distributed guilt, weaponized silence. And he had done it through one thing: listening. The silence was never his absence. It was his feeding. He didn't confess. He consumed. That night, Father Brown barred the church, poured salt across the doors, but at 3:33 a.m., he awoke to find the front pew reassembled, candles lit, and the man sitting, waiting, silent, smiling. Brown approached. The man did not move. Brown knelt, whispered, "What do you want?" And in the stillest voice he'd ever heard, the man replied, "I want you to listen." The lights shattered, the church screamed, and the bell tower rang 7 times, though the rope had long been removed. When dawn broke, the pew was empty again, but in Father Brown's ear, a new voice spoke, not his own, not the killer's, but that of every soul who had ever sat behind the screen. "You know who did it, but the truth will never be told, because the killer never spoke. He only sat. And silence, true silence, is the loudest sin of all." Chapter 8. Angel's wings burned by truth. Her wings were stitched into her back with wire, and when they pulled the charred feathers out, they found teeth marks in the bone. She was found in the nave of St. Eustace's, just after Vespers, burnt beyond recognition, her arms bound in prayer, her body drenched in candle wax, not blood, and on her shoulders, 2 crude appendages made of scorched dove feathers, blackened silver thread, and human cartilage. Wings, not symbolic, not theatrical, surgically fused. And above her, written in soot on the vaulted ceiling, "Angels do not lie, but liars pretend to be angels." No one claimed the body. No parishioner knew her name. But every child in the village said they'd seen her before, floating in the graveyard fog, weeping without a voice, whispering words no one could remember. The coroner ruled it ritualistic homicide, but when the priest who found her tried to speak, he began vomiting feathers, 37 of them, one by one, until he collapsed. He lived, but never spoke again. Father Brown arrived 3 hours after the sun fell. The church was locked, but the wind carried ash through the cracks. He stood before the altar where the girl had burned and found a single object left behind: a music box, small, broken, playing a tune he hadn't heard in 30 years. The melody stopped the moment he touched it. Inside, instead of a dancer, a figurine of a kneeling angel, its face melted smooth. At its base, 3 carved letters, LMB. He knew them, or thought he did, until he checked the parish records and discovered something chilling. The only name ever associated with those initials had died in 1892. A girl, age 12. Cause of death: burned during religious hysteria. Location: St. Eustace's, the same spot the girl had died last night. And that death, too, had involved wings. He read the old file twice, then a third time. The priest who recorded it was later excommunicated for forging documents, falsifying miracles, and one other charge that was never named, only sealed. The church archive had blacked out every reference to what LMB had said before she died. But Father Brown found a scrap of the original letter buried behind the binding. 5 words, scrawled in near-bleeding ink. The angels told me lies. That night the statue of St. Michael cracked down the center. No earthquake, no wind, just a hollow, unexplainable rupture. The sword fell from his hands, the shield turned black, and from the base of the statue leaked wax, like from a candle, but it was warm to the touch and red. That same hour, Father Brown dreamed of a girl with a burned face, singing without a mouth. Her tune matched the music box, but her voice didn't echo in the air. It echoed inside his ribs. When he woke, his pillow was wet with wax. Embedded in the fabric, a single molar. Human, child-sized. The coroner confirmed it wasn't his. He returned to the church, lit a single candle, and just as he did, the shadow of wings danced across the altar wall, though nothing flew above. Then the music box began playing on its own. He opened it. The angel figurine had changed. Now it held a dagger in one hand, and in the other, a scroll, unfurled, etched in microscopic script, dozens of names. He recognized only one, his own. He raced to the confession booth. Inside, feathers, burned, wet, smelling of ash and wine. But beneath them, a note folded into the shape of a wing. You heard her last confession. You said nothing. He didn't remember, did he? He searched old logs, found an entry from 20 years prior. A girl named Lily Marin Blackstone, age 12. Confession recorded, but summary blank. Only a single comment beneath. She said the angels gave her permission. He ran to the archives. The record had been altered, his name scratched in. But the handwriting wasn't his. It was identical to the scrawl from 1892. Impossible. But what was impossible anymore? The next day, he visited the old asylum where Lily had once been sent. It was now a ruin. The walls were covered in soot, every doorway blackened, and one door stood sealed with nails. He pried it open. Inside, a chair, a melted altar, and dozens of sketches on the walls. All the same, a girl with wings. In every drawing, they were burning. And beside one sketch, etched deep into stone, truth scorches what heaven tries to hide. On the floor beneath the chair, the other half of the melted music box. He brought it back to the church, joined the pieces. The tune played again, but this time, a whisper accompanied it. One word, again and again. Listen. Then, the candle on the altar blew out, without wind, and the scent of burning feathers filled the air. That evening, he gathered the remaining villagers, asked if anyone remembered Lily. No one spoke, until a woman, aged, hunched, raised her hand. She was my sister, she said. Did she die? He asked. No, she whispered. She transcended. What do you mean? She left this world with help. Whose help? The woman smiled. Yours, Father. The crowd gasped. He backed away. No, he said. I never. She reached into her coat, pulled out a page, a drawing, from decades ago, of him, in the booth, listening to a girl's voice, and behind her, wings forming, burned at the tips. You were the last one to see her, the woman said. You told her she was chosen. That's what you said, isn't it? He didn't answer, but he remembered. Barely. A girl, crying, shaking, saying things about angels that lived in walls, that whispered things when the candles burned low. He'd said she was special. He'd said God had touched her, and she'd smiled. That was the last time he'd seen her. And now, here she was again. Her name on every wall, her wings in every dream, her voice in every candle's breath. The burning wasn't punishment. It was message, a signal, a warning. She had come back, or something wearing her face had. The next morning, every angel statue in the village turned black, and every child woke up with ash on their pillows. No fire, no smoke, just a silent snowfall of soot. On every window, a handprint, small, charred, pointing toward the church. Inside, the altar candles relit themselves, and beneath the pew, where the girl had burned, the stone cracked. A scroll rose through the floor, impossibly. It was blank, until Father Brown touched it. Then, in blood, it wrote 3 lines. The angels are real, but they never served God. They serve whoever listens. He dropped the scroll. It burned before it hit the floor. That night, he dreamt of wings again. But this time, they weren't hers. They were his. And they were on fire. He woke screaming. On his chest, ash in the shape of feathers. And on the ceiling above his bed, the final phrase, written in candle smoke, "You made her believe the lie. Now you must carry the truth." He returned to the church for the final time and sat in silence. When the music box played again, he didn't flinch. He simply whispered, "I know who did it, but the truth will never be told." Because the wings burned not from sin, they burned from belief. And belief, once set alight, spreads faster than fire. Chapter 9. Someone watched from the vestry. The girl was alone in the chapel, but the mirror behind the altar showed 3 faces. At first, they thought it was grief that made her scream. Her fiancé had been buried that morning after all, drowned in the river behind St. Cyril's, with his lungs full of mud and lilies. They said she came to light a candle, to say goodbye, to beg the dead for peace. But when the scream echoed through the church and shattered every stained glass window on the east wall, the villagers rushed inside and found her curled in the aisle, fingernails torn, eyes wide, mouth full of blood. She hadn't bitten her tongue. She had bitten her own name off a page of the church ledger, ripped it from the wedding registry, swallowed it. And behind the pulpit, facing the holy wall, the old mirror from the vestry, long since removed, was standing upright again, framed in black. Glass cracked down the center. It reflected 3 figures: the girl, someone kneeling behind her, and someone watching from the vestry. But there had been no one there. Father Brown arrived hours later. The girl was sedated, the mirror covered, the chapel locked. No one dared move the mirror, not because they feared a curse, at least not aloud, but because anyone who looked into it claimed to see their own funeral. And in every vision, someone stood at the edge of the coffin, someone in robes, but not a priest. Brown asked to see the mirror. They said no. He asked who had last used it. They hesitated. Then the groundskeeper, Mr. Bellamy, stepped forward and confessed it hadn't been touched in 20 years. Not since the vestry fire, not since the girl's fiancé, Samuel Hartley, had been accused of arson, then vanished into the river, drowned, alone. But now he had returned to her, not as a body, as a reflection. Father Brown uncovered the mirror. It was cold. The frame bore scorch marks. And in the corner, so faint you'd mistake it for a trick of the light, someone had etched a phrase into the glass. He never left the vestry. Brown stared. He didn't see himself in the glass. He saw the vestry door, closed, moving, as if someone were breathing behind it. He turned. The door was still, but on the floor beneath it, A line of salt had been scattered. A ward. Someone was trying to keep something in. That night, he stayed in the chapel, lit a candle, opened his Bible, waited. Midnight came, and then the candle flickered, then split in half, then went out. He didn't move, but the mirror fogged, and a sentence appeared. You buried the wrong man. The next morning, he returned to the graveyard. He exhumed Samuel Hartley's grave. Inside the coffin, bones, but not his, not adult, a child, a boy, age 7. No headstone had ever been moved, no record of reburial. The parish log showed Hartley buried in that spot. But the coffin held someone else, and clutched, in the boy's hand, an old wedding band, not engraved, burned, the initials LW, the name of the priest who performed Samuel's ceremony. Except there had never been a wedding, only the engagement. The priest had vanished a week before the planned vows. Drowned, they said. But now, another grave, another name, another lie. Back inside the church, the mirror had cracked again. Now 4 faces, one of them, Brown's. He turned to leave. The vestry door opened. No one was there. Only a chair and a black robe folded neatly. Inside the pocket, a note, written in Samuel's hand. He said, I had to watch. Brown trembled. He remembered the confession, years ago. A boy, voice shaking. I see them when I sleep, in the mirror, watching. He hadn't believed him. Now he did. The vestry walls were covered in names, scratched, clawed, hundreds, each one someone from the village, each one someone who had disappeared. And at the center, one phrase circled in black ash. He doesn't hear prayers, only secrets. That evening, a child walked into the church alone. She went to the mirror, touched it, and whispered, I saw him. Who? Brown asked. The man in the vestry. What did he do? She turned to him, smiled. He's still listening. Then she passed out, and when she awoke, she had no memory. But in her pocket, a drawing. A man in robes, watching. No face, only eyes. Too many. That night, Brown closed the church, sealed the mirror behind stone. But he couldn't stop what came next. The bells rang, the candles melted, and the vestry door opened without a hand. And on the floor beneath it, footprints, fresh, still wet, leading back toward the mirror. Father Brown whispered the final line of the oldest sermon in the parish. When the watcher steps from the vestry, the confessions begin to speak. And then, just beneath the mirror's sealed glass, something blinked. Not a light, not a flame, an eye, and it was already open. I know who did it, Brown said to the empty room. But the truth watches too. Chapter 10. Father Brown knew too late. They buried the wrong girl, and by the time Father Brown realized it, the bells had already rung 13 times, each toll deeper than the last, echoing from a grave that was never supposed to be opened. It began with a letter. No return address, no handwriting he recognized, just a single sheet of parchment, yellowed by time, that read, You forgave her sin, but you buried mine. At first, he assumed it was another anonymous confession, the kind that appeared from time to time, guilt carried in the dark and slipped beneath the church door like a ghost afraid of being seen. But there was no guilt in the ink, only accusation. He took the letter into the vestry and compared it to the confession logs. The handwriting matched none, but the paper, thick, fibrous, wasn't paper at all. It was a page from the funeral program of a girl buried 6 months ago. Lila Harrow, 17, died in her sleep. The village wept. Father Brown had performed the service himself, and now someone wanted him to believe he had made a mistake, a deadly one. He visited her grave the next morning. The soil hadn't shifted. The marker stood unweathered. But the candle someone had left was burned all the way down, and still warm. That should have been impossible. When he leaned down to place a prayer card beside the stone, he saw it, a crack, thin and jagged, running from the base of the headstone into the earth, a split not caused by time, but pressure. Something from beneath, something trying to rise. He dug, not with tools, with his hands, and 4 feet down he found a coffin, sealed, as expected. But when he opened it, what stared back at him wasn't Lila Harrow. It was an older woman, mouth sewn shut, skin waxen, hands clutching rosary beads burned black. Pinned to her chest, a note. 5 words. She spoke. "Now I sleep." Father Brown staggered back. This wasn't grief. This was theater, a message buried in a lie. He returned to the rectory, unearthed the funeral registry, and saw another error. Lila Harrow's death had been witnessed by a nurse named Eliza Marchant. But Eliza had died the year before, in another village. Her name had no place on that page. He confronted the undertaker. The man trembled before answering. Said the girl's body had arrived already in the coffin, sealed, delivered by order of the family. But when Father Brown asked which family member had signed for it, the undertaker went silent. "There was no name," he whispered. "Just a seal, an angel with no eyes." That was when Father Brown knew something was wrong, not just with the burial, but with everything surrounding it. He searched old records, found mention of the angel seal once before, on a case from decades past. Another girl, same age, similar features, same parish. She had vanished. Her final words, "Tell Father Brown the truth is watching." But that was impossible. That girl had died before he was ordained. So how had she known his name? The answer came at midnight. He returned to the church, sat alone in the nave, listened to the creak of wood, the hum of silence. Then, softly, from beneath the altar, a knock. 3 slow taps. He knelt, moved the cloth. A compartment he had never seen. Inside, a candle, unlit, and beside it, a lock of hair, tied in white ribbon. So familiar, he almost spoke her name. But the moment he struck a match, the candle burst into flame, green and flickering, throwing shadows that didn't match the room. And then the whisper came. "You buried her soul, but her body still walks." He turned. The church was empty. The candle blew out. On the ground, ashes spelled a name he had not heard in 30 years. Margaret Vale, a girl he had known as a young curate. A girl who vanished one Easter Sunday. A girl who had confessed something so terrible he had locked her name from his memory. But now she was back, or someone was using her name. The next morning, another letter, this time pinned to the confessional door. No ink, just blood. The message, "You knew, but not soon enough." That night, Lila Harrow's mother came to the church, face pale, eyes hollow. She said she had been having dreams of her daughter standing in the doorway, mouth open, but no sound coming out. And behind her, in the dream, a shadow wearing priest's robes, not hers, but Father Brown's. She screamed at him. "What did you tell her? What did you say that made her climb into that coffin alive?" He didn't answer, because he didn't know, or didn't want to know. He returned to the grave again, the soil undisturbed, but the candle was gone, and in its place, a shoe, small, white, burned at the edges. Inside it, a folded scrap of cloth, altar linen, stained, with a single handprint in ash, too small to be his, but not too old. When he brought it back to the rectory, he noticed something else, stitched in the hem of the linen in thread too fine for the eye. A sentence. You called it mercy. She called it betrayal. That was when the bells began, unscheduled, 13 times, each louder than the last. He rushed to the belfry, no one there, but the rope was swinging. At the base of the bell, a white feather, smeared in soot. He looked down. On the floor beneath the bell, carved into the wood in a shaky hand, were the words, "You knew, but too late." He collapsed in the pews, cried. And then the girl appeared. Not Lila, not Margaret, someone in between. She walked barefoot down the aisle, robes trailing, face hidden behind a veil. She stopped before him, reached into her dress, held out a book, a Bible. But when he opened it, the pages were blank. All but one, the final one. It read, "You forgave the sin, but never heard the truth." Then she vanished. No sound, no wind, just the scent of lilies and old wax. And then from the pulpit, a new sound. Breathing. Not his, not human. He approached. The pulpit was empty, but beneath it, in the hidden drawer where communion wine was once kept, a letter, addressed to him, in his own handwriting, but he'd never written it. It read, "I knew, but I feared what would come if I spoke. Now the dead walk, and the truth walks with them." He fell to his knees and whispered, "I know who did it." But the candle blew out, and the mirror cracked, and somewhere beneath the earth, a second bell began to ring. The one they swore they'd dismantled, the one they buried, with her. Too late. Chapter 11. She confessed, then vanished forever. She confessed to a murder no one remembered, and by morning she no longer existed in any record that proved she had ever been born. The parish called her Alice Wren, quiet girl, pale as parchment, eyes like moonlight caught in water. She came to Father Brown's church one evening when the sky was the color of lead and the rain refused to end. She asked for confession, nothing strange, until she said what she'd done. "I killed a man who never lived," she whispered through the screen, "and he's coming back for me." Father Brown froze. Her voice didn't tremble. It was calm, certain, almost relieved. He asked her who the man was. She didn't give a name. She gave a date. "Tomorrow," she said. "At dawn, he'll walk through the vestry doors." He thought she was delusional, haunted by grief or guilt, but when he asked if she believed she deserved forgiveness, she said something that made his blood run cold. "I don't want forgiveness, Father. I want permission." That night, she left the church and disappeared into the rain. By morning, the vestry door was open. The footprints that led inside, bare, small, unmistakably hers, never came back out. The police found nothing. No body, no blood, no struggle. The church was silent, except for the sound of dripping water and the smell of candle wax. But when Father Brown walked to the confessional where she'd spoken, he found something wedged beneath the seat. A silver key, small, smooth, stained red. Attached to it, a piece of torn cloth from her dress. He took it home, locked it in a drawer, and tried to forget. But at midnight, he woke to the sound of a door creaking open, soft, deliberate, the same sound as the vestry. When he lit his candle, the drawer was open. The key was gone. The next day, he searched the archives. He needed to find her family, her name, some trace of her existence. But the baptism records had been altered. Page 472, where her name should have been, was missing, torn clean out, and the logbook from last month's confessions, gone. Every mention of her had vanished. And then another letter arrived. It was folded in black paper, sealed with melted wax in the shape of a cross. No return address. Inside, one line, written in delicate, almost childlike script. Thank you for listening. He forgave me too. There was no signature. Father Brown's candle flickered violently. He turned, and in the glass pane of the rectory window, his own reflection stared back. But it wasn't alone. Someone was standing behind him. He spun around. No one there, just the echo of dripping water again. He followed the sound to the vestry. The floorboards were wet, though the church was dry, and on the wall above the confessional, a single word had appeared, drawn in what looked like ash. Return. That night, he dreamed of Alice. She stood at the altar in a black veil, her hands clasped tight. The man she claimed to have killed was kneeling beside her. His face was covered, his chest still bleeding. And when he spoke, his voice was identical to Father Brown's. He woke up screaming. He tried to reason it away. Fatigue, stress, imagination. But when dawn came, the key had returned. It was lying on his pillow. And now it was warm. He brought it to the church, searching for what it might unlock. The only door in the building that had no keyhole was the old archive vault beneath the altar. A relic sealed for decades, said to contain the confessions of priests long dead. The bishop had forbidden anyone from opening it. But the key fit perfectly. He turned it. The lock clicked. Inside, no books, no relics, just mirrors, dozens of them, lining the walls from floor to ceiling. And in every mirror, his reflection, except one, the one in the corner. There, a girl in a black dress stared back. Her eyes glowed faintly, not evil, not angelic, just knowing. She lifted her hand, pointed to the far wall. Etched into the glass behind her reflection, a message appeared as though breathed into existence. You gave him absolution. You sealed his sin in me. And then her image vanished. He turned toward the wall. A small metal drawer he'd never noticed before. Locked. He used the same key. Inside, a vial of water. Holy water. And beneath it, a single sheet of parchment. Old, crumbling, stained. A confession written in his own handwriting. But the date was wrong. It was dated 15 years in the future. The words read, "She came to me at last. I let her in. I was the man she killed." He dropped it. The vial shattered. The holy water hissed as if it struck fire. And from the corner of the vault, a soft voice echoed. "Father, you said I could go." He turned, choking on breath. She was there again. Alice. No blood, no wounds, just a faint, flickering translucence. She smiled sadly. "It worked," she whispered. "You freed me." Then she dissolved. Into air, into silence, into nothing. But her key, her cursed little key, remained, lying on the stone where she had stood. The next day, the bishop summoned Father Brown. He had questions. The church bell had rung at 3 in the morning, without a hand to pull it. Villagers had seen shadows moving in the steeple. They'd heard a girl crying. Father Brown told them nothing. But when they left, he opened his prayer journal and found a new page, written in a hand not his own. It said, "Forgive me, Father, for I have returned." And beneath it, the same wax seal. That evening, he went to the confessional again. He sat, waited. Nothing. Then the air grew colder. The candle flickered out, and someone sat down on the other side. Her voice, gentle, trembling, slipped through the screen. "Father, I did what you told me." He wanted to speak, to say her name, but his throat wouldn't move. "You said if I told the truth, I'd be free," she continued. "You said sin ends in light." He could barely breathe. "What did you do, child?" he whispered. A pause, then a sigh. "I buried him. I buried you." The candle relit itself. The seat beside him was empty, but her rosary hung from the screen, its beads black with soot. The next morning, the villagers found the church empty, the doors wide open, the confession booth overturned, and etched into the wood where Father Brown had sat, his own name carved deep enough to draw blood. In his chamber, the key was gone. Only the broken vial remained, its contents evaporated, leaving behind a faint scent of iron and incense. No one ever saw him again. But weeks later, a woman appeared at the parish. Pale, quiet, clutching a rosary, she asked to confess. The new priest welcomed her in. She knelt, spoke softly. "I killed a man who never lived," she said. And outside, the vestry door creaked open again. In the candlelight, two shadows fell across the floor. One of them hers, the other, listening. And if you listen closely, you can still hear her voice echo through that empty church, whispering words that should never be heard again. "Forgive me, Father, for I was never gone." And somewhere, wherever the darkness finally ends, Father Brown whispers back, "I know who did it, but the truth will never be told." Chapter 12. One soul lied to God. He begged for absolution, with a rope already around his neck, and by the time the prayer ended, the floorboards beneath him were soaked in someone else's blood. They found the man hanging in the bell tower of St. Luke's just before sunrise. No sign of a struggle, no missing items, no note, except for the single line scrawled in ash across the stone wall behind him. One soul lied to God. That should have been the end of it. A tragic suicide. But the rope wasn't tied in any known knot. The priest who cut him down said it was woven like a crown. And stranger still, the body wasn't cold. It was warm, heart beating, dead, but alive enough to bleed. Father Brown stood beside the body as it lay on the stone. The man's lips were moving. No voice, no breath, just the faintest twitch of mouth muscle. Over and over, the same shape. A word Brown couldn't hear, but could read. It was his name. That afternoon, the bell above the tower tolled once on its own. It hadn't rung in 60 years. That was when Brown remembered something. Not a crime, not a sin, a promise. Decades ago, he'd heard a confession so strange, he'd sealed the record with wax and buried it behind the vestry wall. A young boy had come to him and said, "One day I'll lie to God so well that he'll forgive me before I sin." At the time, Brown thought it was poetry, madness perhaps, but now, staring at this man's body, the way his jaw had formed Brown's name, he wasn't so sure. He returned to the vestry, dug behind the wall. The box was still there, dust-covered, sealed. He opened it. Inside, one sheet of paper, blank, except for one sentence, burned, not written, into the parchment. "Do you remember what I said?" And below it, a signature, the same name etched into the bell tower's death log that morning. The man who had died hadn't been listed on any census. No records, no birth, no baptism. But Brown had heard him speak, once in that booth, long ago, in a voice that didn't shake, didn't ask, didn't beg, just stated, "I will become a lie so perfect, even the angels will believe me real." That night, a child came to the church. She carried a candle, said she had seen the man in her dreams, said he had asked her to bring this to Father Brown. A feather, white, unburnt, wrapped in linen. Brown took it. The child left. But as soon as the door shut, the feather turned black in his hand. No fire, no heat, just changed. And on the linen beneath it, blood had begun to write something. Slow, deliberate, one letter at a time. His name. Again. But then the writing continued. "You forgot me. You forgave someone else. You sealed my truth in another's name." Brown recoiled, dropped it. The feather crumbled into ash. He knelt beside the altar, and then the lights went out. All but one candle remained lit. The candle that hadn't burned in 40 years. It was the one used for last rites. But he hadn't performed any rites for the man in the tower. The body had vanished from the morgue. Vanished. No explanation, just gone. The priest on duty swore the table was empty when he returned from a phone call, the sheet still blood-stained, the air thick with incense, though none had been lit. Father Brown visited the bell tower again. The rope was still there, uncut, hanging. And above it, carved now into the wooden beam, another sentence. Lies ascend faster than prayers. He searched the archives. The name appeared in old newspapers, brief mentions. A boy seen at crime scenes. A witness never found. A suspect that vanished. No image, only a name. Over and over again. Attached to pain, to fires, to confessions that turned out to be false. But the name never aged. Always the same handwriting. Always the same sentence given to police. He said God would forgive him in advance. Brown returned to his chambers and found the floor covered in letters, all addressed to him. None stamped, none delivered by hand. They had simply appeared. He opened one, then another, each one a confession. But they weren't from the man. They were from others, dozens, hundreds, each one saying, "He made me lie. He said it would be forgiven. He said it was practice." Then the final letter, shorter than the rest. One sentence, "I am not the only soul who lied." And a postscript, "You did too." He stared at it for hours. Then he remembered. The one time he had lied in confession. Not as a priest, as a boy. To protect someone, to protect this same man. He had taken the blame for a theft in the orphanage, said it was him, been punished, while the boy watched, smiling. The boy who had said afterward, "See, even God believed you." Brown never forgot the bruises, but he had forgotten the name, until now. He ran back to the bell tower. The rope was gone. In its place, a mirror, cracked, the frame carved with flames and eyes, and in the reflection, not Brown, the boy, aged not a day, whispering, smiling. "I lied to God," he said, "and he forgave me." Then he raised a hand, held up a book. It was Brown's Bible, but every page had changed, the ink smeared, every name replaced, every sin reassigned, every absolution undone. And at the center, a portrait of Father Brown, crowned in ash, robe torn, mouth sewn shut. He tried to scream, but the tower swallowed sound. He fell to his knees, whispered the only thing he could. "Why?" The boy's voice answered from the mirror. "Because you believed me. You gave me grace before I knew guilt. You wrote my name in heaven before I had sinned. You made me real." Then the mirror shattered. Brown opened his eyes. He was alone. But on the floor around him, 12 feathers, each one burned at the tip, each one carrying a name of someone he had forgiven over the years. But they weren't victims. They were the guilty, the truly guilty. Each one had vanished after confession, each one tied to deaths, to lies, to unholy things. He had set them free. He had absolved the wrong souls, and now they were returning. The candle at the altar burst into flame, and in the shadow it cast on the wall wings, not divine, not demonic, just broken, fractured by too much grace, too much misplaced mercy. The truth wasn't watching anymore, it was walking. Inside his church, inside him. The doors of the chapel blew open, wind and ash spilled in, and at the threshold, the boy. No longer smiling, older now, but not by age, by consequence. "You made the lie holy," he said, "and now God can't tell us apart." Brown stood, walked toward him, trembling, weeping. "I was trying to save you." "No," the boy said. "You were trying to save yourself, and now the lie has grown bigger than you." He vanished, and the air fell silent. The candles extinguished themselves, and from deep beneath the church, laughter, soft, mocking. The ground trembled once, then stilled. When the sun rose, Father Brown had not left the church, but the pews were full of shadows, figures that should not be, figures who had lied, figures who had been forgiven. And at the altar, his Bible lay open, every page blank, but one line carved into the wood beneath it. One soul lied to God, and heaven listened. And as the bells began to ring again, Brown whispered his final words into the empty air. "I know who did it, but the truth was never mine to speak."